Hello, 2BC. I'm back. I'm here again in this Genesis series. Stephanie and I were talking about this, and I had so much fun with the Joseph story whenever we went through Genesis with our students back in the fall, that I asked, hey, can I take a stab at making a video for the adult Sunday school classes. And so here I am. I'm going to take a stab at walking through Joseph's story with you. So today we're going to cover all of Joseph's story. I know that you're going to talk about it across the course of a number of weeks, but the story is really cool, and it's a whole, it covers multiple chapters. There's lots to go into, lots of conversations. Y'all are going to have a great time unpacking this, but as a whole story, I just want to take a few minutes and just walk through the whole thing. But before we do that, let's pray. Father, I just thank you for the opportunity to unpack your word. I thank you for the story of Joseph. Right here at the end of this book of origins, we have this incredible story of a whole life, a life lived before you, starting with just the teenage years, moving all the way into the adult years, and just getting to see how Joseph grows up. And as we unpack some of these little details that we have shared with us in Scripture, that you would just speak to our hearts, that you would challenge us to go deeper in your word, to explore what you have revealed here, as well as to just challenge us in the way we live out our faith in our everyday moments. And we just pray all of this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. We come onto the scene in chapter 37 on Joseph, who is the eldest son of Jacob and Rachel, which we know is not his eldest son. He has many other sons from his wife, Leah. And so we see that here we find Joseph, a teenager, and we follow him from this moment for 20 years until something significant happens in his life. And we watch those 20 years unpack. And then we watch all the way to his death. And that's so we get to see from his teenage years all the way to his death. And it's a pretty eye-opening journey. And so Joe has this responsibility placed on him by his dad to go and check in with his brothers who are taking care of the family's flocks, because the family works together and they're nomadic shepherds. They take care of goats and sheep, and this is what we have seen throughout Genesis. And so the men of the clan, the men of the family, the other sons are out taking care of the herd, and Joseph is sent to go check on them. And we see that Joseph doesn't find favor with his brothers because he speaks the truth to his father about what he sees whenever they're cutting corners or they're not doing something that's just the way it should be, that he reports this to their father, Jacob. And we see that in this, that he has two dreams. He has two dreams that tell Joseph that at some point in the future, he would be the leader of the clan. Now, this has already been made clear by his father, because he's been given a colorful robe, a special gift, a designation that probably should have been given to the firstborn, but we'll get back to that here in a second, and designating that Joseph is the preferred son by Jacob. And now he has these two dreams who say that he will be the leader of the clan, of the family, that actually his brothers and his parents would bow down to him. And so Joseph's brothers have enough. And so one day he's out checking on the flocks, seeing how the brothers are doing business, and they grab him and they're going to kill him. But they stop themselves. They have a conversation amongst themselves. They stop themselves and they throw him in a well. And then some nomadic traders come by and they sell him into slavery. Joseph's taken from there near the Mediterranean and there in the land that will become Israel. And he is sold into slavery down in Egypt. But not just to anybody, but to the captain of the guard, a wealthy estate. And there we see that Joseph rises to management. And underneath his management, the household flourishes. But the woman of the house, the wife of the captain of the guard, she has an eye for Joseph, and she tries to tempt him, tries to entice him. And Joseph refuses, but she slanders his name, and he's thrown into jail. He's thrown into jail, and there in jail he sits, stuck. Went from being preferred son to being in slavery to now being wrongfully jailed. And in jail, once again, he's placed in charge of the prison. And in charge of the prison, things succeed. The prisoners are happy. The warden is happy. Everything's going well. And then 2 prisoners show up directly connected to the Pharaoh, the baker and the cupbearer, and they have dreams. And they can't figure out, they're perturbed by their dreams. And Joe hears the dreams. And he tells them that God can interpret their dreams. And Joe then prays and talks to God, and he gives them, God enables him to interpret these dreams. One of these is in a dream that tells him that he is about to be executed. The other, that he'd be returned to his position with Pharaoh. And these dreams come true, just as Joseph said that they would. Years go by, and then Pharaoh has dreams, and then no one can be found to interpret the dreams. But then the cupbearer remembers, aha, I know someone who can take care of this. They bring Joseph out of prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh says, you're such a wise man, then we should put you in charge of all the kingdom of Egypt. And that's exactly what happens to Joseph. And the story doesn't end there, though, because this drought that was coming, that Joseph predicted through Pharaoh's dreams, soon hits Jacob and the sons back home. And the sons have to head to Egypt for food. And Joseph and the sons meet. One of the things that is consistent throughout Genesis, one of those observations that I want to share with you, I got 5 of them today, I'm going to try to get in here. I want to share with you is that God uses these messy families to move throughout his story. And there's such an interesting parts throughout this. We see, and one of those is we find fathers who are not taking care of their responsibilities. So right here, we see this with how it connects Jacob and Judah. Jacob had this tension in his household between all the wives, which we could talk about that and how the leadership of his house in that way. But we also see this tension in the fact that he is showing preference over one set of sons over Joseph. So Joseph over the older sons, that he is stepping out of birth order. And we could talk about how he sees this tension in his household building, and he does nothing to bring peace, which would all be his responsibility as the patriarch of the clan, is to bring all of these different tension pieces inside his family and bring peace, to bring them to the table. And instead, he only fuels the fire. And we see that this continues to be passed down to Judah in the way that he here fails to take care of his clan, to take care of his family. And one of the things that's interesting about Joseph's character, we'll see years later, whenever Jacob goes to bless Joseph's sons, he reverses his hands and puts his blessing for the eldest son on Joseph's secondborn, and on his secondborn, or the firstborn blessing on the secondborn, and the secondborn blessing on the firstborn. And Joseph tries to prevent that from happening. He tries to correct his father. And it's just one small way we see that Joseph was different. And one of the things I want to back up and just think about for a minute here is that in our stories throughout Genesis, we see that Genesis is stories of origin, stories of the beginnings. And we see that God calls each of these people, right? We see God calling Noah, God calling Abraham, God calling Isaac, and God calling Jacob. And we see that over and over again. But when we get to Joseph, we get 2 dreams and no mention of God. But it's so fascinating because it's very clear that this is God's calling on his life. God has a direction. God has a purpose. And he tells him at the very beginning, this is what is going to happen. Now, why is it this way? Why is it described this way? I don't know. But I just find that interesting. So Joseph is called to lead his people. Joseph is called to be a leader. Joseph is called to be one that his brothers would bow down to. And so then we see God being faithful. Even though not named, we see that God was faithful. His brothers don't kill him. He's sold to a powerful person with the inside track to Pharaoh. We see that if we look at over here in 39, when his master saw that the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household. And credit is given to God for this success. This isn't just a little business acumen. This is that God is giving Joseph a supernatural leadership ability. This calling that he placed on his life through these visions is now being fleshed out here in the success. But alas, we see that Potiphar's wife has it out for Joseph. She is attracted to him. She tries to seduce him. He has integrity. He rebuffs her. But then she concocts a story and tells her husband that Joseph has wronged her. And Joseph's thrown into prison. Second time in his young life that he has been wrongfully imprisoned and accused and mistreated. And here he finds himself in prison. But God was even faithful there. We see that in the prison that he was brought to a place where the warden trusted him completely. And everything that Joseph did, he succeeded in. And the warden could trust him with all the prisoners and all the affairs of the prison. And so Joseph was acting in many ways as a deputy warden. I mean, it was all because of God's hand there. And as he's going through these duties, we see, so God has been faithful, that Joseph is faithful. Again, we've seen Joseph be faithful in the way that he responds with integrity to Potiphar's wife. And now we see, even in the way that he carries out his leadership, he sees that the cupbearer and the baker of the king have come into the prison. After they've been in custody for some time, this is in verse 5 of 40, it says, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of his own. And when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were dejected. So he was in charge of the prison, and he cared about the prisoners to the point where he recognized that there was something wrong. And so then he asked them about it. And they tell him that they've had dreams. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And so right there, we see that once again, Joseph was faithful. He says, God can interpret dreams. I can't interpret dreams, but God can interpret dreams. So let's give this a shot. And so they give it a shot. They tell Joseph their dreams, and then he gives them an interpretation. God gives him, open his mind, open his heart to what these mean. One's going to be restored, one's going to be executed, and exactly that happens. But we see that the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. When he got back working for Pharaoh, right there, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, he didn't say anything about Joseph's plight there in prison. So God was faithful, Joseph was faithful, God was faithful, Joseph was faithful. And we see that over and over again. And once again, we see it even keeps going, because when 2 years, Joseph's in prison, go by. And now Pharaoh has had some dreams. And in these dreams, he is terrified because he has seen some horrible things. Healthy grain getting devoured by sickly looking grain. Healthy cows getting eaten by some sickly, scrawny cows. And no one can answer what these dreams mean. So finally, the cupbearer has an aha moment. He's like, hey, I remember this guy, Joe. He's over there in jail, and he's been sitting there, rotting there for 2 years. Whoops, forgot about him. But he has the ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh's like, well, why didn't you say anything until now? And so they bring Joseph in. And if we look at chapter 41 verse 15, we see some of this exchange between Joseph and the Pharaoh. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph quickly, brought him from the dungeon. When he shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph says, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph's faithful again. Joseph didn't take credit, but he gives it all to God. So then Pharaoh tells him his dreams, just like the cupbearer had done, about 7 skinny heads of grain devouring 7 healthy ones, 7 skinny cows devouring 7 healthy cows. And Joseph is given the answer by God. And he tells Pharaoh that there will be 7 really good years of crops, but then 7 really bad years of drought will be coming upon not just Egypt, but the whole land. And then there's a period there in verse 32. And then in 33, Joseph keeps talking and he says, and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect the food of these good years that are coming, store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in cities in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Did you catch that? There in 41, Joseph goes from being in jail, standing before Pharaoh, interpreting a dream supernaturally. And soon as he hears the dream, and in the moment as he hears the dream, and he understands the vision as God enables him, he instantly has a plan of what Pharaoh should do. And he offers it to Pharaoh. He advises Pharaoh from the dungeon cell to Pharaoh's court as an advisor in just a matter of moments. Joseph's story his situation is turning around. And we see in this moment that we've seen God moving supernaturally through Joseph's life. He calls him supernaturally. He then brings him faithfully and safely to this point through all of these different situations. But we also see that God has been at work through all of those circumstances, equipping Joseph. Joseph has been to God's academy of management. We see that God had been at work with Joseph, equipping him. Think about this. He was placed as the manager of the whole kingdom. That's the end result here in 41. And how did God prepare him for that moment? 13 years of a long process. Now that's a long school, especially when it's the school of hard knocks. Chapter 37, when Joe receives his dream, and then chapter 41, 46 tells us he's 30 years old. That's where I came up with the 13 years. He was enslaved by his family. He's wrongfully in prison. He's forgotten. But if we'll recall that he was the key kind of person who had an inside scoop about the family flocks. He was learning how to manage the flocks, to manage the family business back way whenever he was a teenager. Then he became a manager of an estate, but he worked his way up. He saw all the different steps of lowest slave on the totem pole all the way up to the manager of the household. And same thing in the prison, just regular old prisoner there in the dungeon, and then works his way up, building trust to where the warden trusts him with everything. And he's caring for all the affairs and all those who are in the prison. He always accomplished his necessary tasks. Think about being a manager of an estate, all the complex webs of relationships that he had to manage with all of the different vendors and different contractors and all of the farmers and workers and just all the different parts of the aspect of running a huge estate. All of this was we are told not only was he able to do it just like at a bare minimum, keep it going kind of place, but everything excelled to the point where those who in charge recognized what was going on. And so how did Joseph manage? Joseph managed because he knew first he was trained by knowing the heart of a tribal chief, his dad. Then he learned the heart of the captain of the guard. Then he learned the heart of the warden of the palace. But at the same time, he knew the heart of the common people. He even knew the heart of a slave. He knew the heart of prisoners, those who have been in prison justly and unjustly. And all of this comes to a head here in chapter 41, where we see that he is put in charge of all of Egypt. He offers this advice, and Pharaoh just says, yeah, that makes sense. And you're the man. You're the one that's going to do this. And he empowers Joseph, which that in itself is its own cool story, but really it's just setting up what God has been working towards all along. And we see that this famine comes. The good years of crops happen. They store all the food. Then the bad years come. And it gets bad for Jacob and all of his sons. And so Jacob learns that there's food in Egypt. And he sends his sons to Egypt to get some food. And this is just a fascinating tale, like this interaction, because the brothers show up in Egypt and they have no clue who Joseph is. They have no clue who Joseph is. Yet but Joseph knows who they are. And so here they are, and they tell their whole story and why they need food. And Joseph gets them the food. But then he comes to them and he puts them to the test. He calls them spies, verse 14. And he says, this is how you'll be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother, because they told him about this youngest brother they had there, talked about losing one of the brothers, and now there's one more brother who's still back home. You bring him here. And just to make sure that all of their heads are on straight, he throws them all in prison. And on the third day, he says, do this and you'll live, for I fear God. If you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain to your starving families, but you must bring your youngest brother back. So he takes one of the brothers, collateral, sends them back home. So the brothers take the grain, head back home. Simeon is the one that is bound and taken to jail. Joseph is overcome by emotion. He has to step away. And then Joseph orders all their bags to be filled with grain, but then to put their money back in. So they head out, and then on their way back, after they've gotten some distance down the road, they find their money. And they're overwhelmed. They're scared by what this might mean for them later. But they make it back home. They tell their dad, Jacob, the story of what has happened. And he's overwhelmed. He's like, I cannot send another son to die. One, because he's got one in jail there, but one, because his wife Rachel, his favorite, has already lost his eldest son from his favorite wife, and he's only got one left. And he doesn't want to send him. So they don't do anything. They just leave Simeon there, rotting in jail in Egypt. They got their grain. Cool. One less mouth to feed, I guess. I mean, it's not like he's married and has family. Oh, wait, he does. But we're just going to leave him there. Cool. So they do. And the famine keeps going. Years of famine. And so it's still, so they eat all the grain they have. And their dad, Jacob, he's like, all right, go back, get some more. But remember that thing about Simeon's still there and how we have to bring Benjamin with us to get more grain. And so begrudgingly, there's this whole back and forth, and Judah sets up this arrangement with the dad about hey, my family for your family kind of arrangement. And finally, they convince him to send Benjamin back. So they took the gifts, they took the extra payment, they took the silver that they had been returned to them, they took their empty sacks, they took Benjamin, and they head off to Egypt. And they get there, and when they're there, their first thing they do, they tell hey, we're back for more food, blah, blah, right? And then when we stopped at the night, the last time we found our money, here all of it is. And the steward working for Joseph says, actually, I got all your payment. He says, in fact, so like now that you're here, let's get you some more food. And actually, Joseph wants to have a meal with you. So they prepare their gifts and get ready to have this meal with Joseph. And Joseph walks in and he sees them all there. And then he sees Benjamin. He's overcome with emotion. He steps out, he weeps, and he collects himself, and then he comes back in. And whenever he comes back in, he has all the brothers seated by birth order. And he gives Benjamin 5 times as much as anyone else. So they feast and they drink freely, and then Joseph gives them the instructions to his steward. All right, fill their sacks, send them on their way, but put my silver cup in there, along with all their payment. Then soon they're chased down by some of Joseph's men and accuse them of stealing some of the goods from Joseph's house. And they're like, why would we steal that? We brought payment back whenever we found it in our sacks the last time. Why would we have a need to steal stuff? But he's like, well, let's see. And then they, of course, say, whoever it is going to go back and be put in jail, blah, blah, all that sort of stuff. And so here we go. So they lower their sacks, they look in their sacks, and they find, where is the cup but in Benjamin's sack? The one that their father cares about the most, right? This youngest son. And so they all come back to Egypt because they can't just let Joseph's men take him. And so they tore their clothes, and they all lowered their donkeys, returned to the city. Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. Joseph said to them, what is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? What can we say to the Lord? Judah replied, what can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves. We are ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup. But, so like, there's this crazy scene. It's almost like an awakening for the brothers. They've lived these 20 years kind of suppressing this guilt, all having the same conspiracy theory, this story that the brother was killed by wild animals and we didn't really sell him into slavery. And that's kind of the lie they've had to keep up for this long. All of them have had to keep this lie up to the rest of their whole family, to their dad, to everybody. And now it's kind of like, oh no, this has come back to us. This is God. He's revealing our guilt. So the brothers say this. So now if the boy is not with us, when I go back to your servant, my father, and the father whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if this boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father. And then it's like Joseph had heard enough. He had heard this transformation inside his brothers, and then he reveals his identity. He says, I am Joseph, and there's weeping and there's reuniting, and they come back together. And then the brothers go back and they go tell their dad, and the whole family, the whole entire clan family unit comes to Egypt. Now, can you imagine that conversation? What that must have been like for those brothers to go to their dad and be like, now, Dad, you remember 20 years ago when we told you that Joseph was killed by wild animals? Yeah, son, that's why I've been sad all these years. Yeah, so we made that story up. You what? Yeah, we are the ones that dipped that robe in blood. We really just sold him into slavery. But he's alive now, and he's like second in charge of Egypt. And we're going to go move there because they have food. He asked us to come. He's got a place for us to live. So what do you think? Like, how do you tell your dad that after 20 years of hiding a secret? Not just one of them, but all of them has been pulling this wool over their dad's eyes for that long. But they do. They come clean, and they all move to Egypt. And that's what we see throughout the rest of this. We see is that Jacob goes to Egypt. He reunites with Joseph. He gets to meet Joseph's sons. And so they go, because of this famine, to this land, to Egypt, so Joseph can care for them. And there, all of that calling that God had placed on his life, all of that training, all of that came to fruition so that this family of promise would be sustained in the midst of this famine 48 and 49 is filled with Jacob blessing his sons and meeting, and it's a lot of moving the family forward. And in 50, we see that, at the end of 49, Jacob dies. In 50, we see that his brothers are very nervous now that their dad is not here. What will happen to them? And we see in 50, verse 19, when Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God, your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I'll provide you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And then Joseph stays in Egypt, and he sets up with his descendants of right before he passes that they would take his bones whenever they leave Egypt one day. And then Joseph dies. And that's the end of the story of Genesis, the story of beginnings. I want to back up just for a second. So this whole thing that Joseph says here. So the brothers intended harm, but God took that and used it to preserve the family, to create new life. What they intended it was for death, God created life. The last thing I really wanted to kind of point out here about Joseph's story is it's fascinating because Joseph's story in many ways is a motif for many other biblical stories. Joseph's life encapsulates a lot of what we've already seen here in the Old Testament. Noah is the only one seeming to follow God. We see that with Joseph. At first, we don't hear God's name mentioned, but then all of a sudden, as we see Joseph rise in success, where does he attribute it? It's attributed to God. Joseph was faithful, even in the midst of all these messy, horrible things that were happening to him. Like Abraham, Joseph had to leave everything that he knew. Like Jacob, he's a victim of his parents' favoritism. He travels to escape trouble with his brothers. He's mistreated by those he lives with in exile. God works in mighty ways despite tough circumstances. And then we see that Joseph's story, in a way, is even like Jesus' story. He is betrayed by his brothers. He's handed over to foreigners to be killed. He lived above reproach, but yet he was still mistreated and falsely accused. God used his circumstances, these horrible circumstances, to bring about new life. Joseph was thought to be dead, but God made him second to Pharaoh so that he might forgive his brothers and save the covenant people of God. Jesus was dead. God brought him to life, and he seated him in heaven where he forgives all who betray him. Not just those who killed him, but you and me as well. So that those of us who turn to him and believe will be new covenant people. As you have journeyed through Genesis, I hope that it has been an exciting and eye-opening journey. Genesis has so much in it that sets up what happens throughout the rest of Scripture. To see God at work from the beginning of creation all the way into establishing a people who would bear witness to his presence and his love in the world. So much of Joseph's story, I think, is relatable. And that's why I return to it over and over again. And hopefully for you, you will take some time to read over these next few weeks, to read through these chapters, to read from 37 through 50, and to see how God moves. Even in these days, in these early days where God is not named in Joseph's story, that God is calling Joseph, laying a calling on his life, and he's equipping him. Maybe that for you would be something that you could stop and you could ponder. How is God calling you? What is calling has he placed on you? God has called all of us as followers of Jesus to join him in kingdom work. And further, God is qualifying all of us. He's equipping all of us. Maybe take some time, reflect backwards. How is God been preparing you to be where you are now? How's he at work right now, working in your heart? Maybe you might notice something of how God is equipping you. Maybe there's a way he's equipped you that you're not using. This conversation with Joseph about calling and how God equips us and prepares us for the present moment is one that we all need to wrestle with as we follow Jesus. And we wrestle with how he is calling us to live out this command to love God and love others. And I know for a lot of us that the idea of family strife and tension and just trying to make all of that work, Joseph's story is a huge one to take some time and ponder and wrestle about how do we forgive? How do we reconcile? How do we lay aside long past hurts? Joseph was in the position to devastate his family. By the world's standard, he had every right to deny them food, to punish them, to kill them, to destroy their lives. But we are told that he weeps for them. And he's moved with compassion for them. How does Joseph get to that point? We see his faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to him, and his recognition that God was faithful to him brings him to a place where he can forgive his brothers. They intended ill, but God intended good. And we see because Joseph recognized that, he's able to forgive them. And there's something for all of us in there to wrestle with about forgiveness. And finally, just the brothers themselves, to realize that we are not done yet. That God's grace extends to us. We can make horrible mistakes. We can step way out of line with God's path. And he calls us over and over again back to himself, forgives us, heals us, and restores us. That's the grace of Jesus Christ. But we're going to wrap up right there. I hope this has been a good conversation, just walking through Joseph's story, maybe pulling out a few of those interesting tidbits that are there. And I pray that as you read through it on your own, that you will just take that time to not just read these words, not just hear the story, but truly meditate. Take care. Bye.